Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lacey.
Hey.
You can find us online at justonemorefix.com or on Twitter at justonemorefix. If you like us, head over to iTunes or to Google Play and give us a rating and a comment. In this episode, we're going to talk about making better monsters again. And now, it's time to get our gaming fix.
I'm Kier.
I'm Haley.
And I'm Jay from Gallifrey Public Radio,
A podcast member of the Gonna Geek Network.
just like the one you're listening to right now.
The opinions expressed are those of each individual.
Check out all the other podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
And get ready, because geekiness begins in 3,
2,
1.
Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. So as you heard, we are going to talk about making better monsters again. The reason again is because as you hear, this is dropping a day late, and there was a giant mistake that I made when I was recording our last recording session, I guess. I don't know how you want to say that. And the sample rate that it was recorded at was absolutely terrible because of another project and some of Lacey's homework, and I didn't get it changed back to the default settings. So it wrecked it, and the audio quality was terrible, and it was definitely not up to our standards for what we like to put out to you guys. So we are re-recording this with just me and Lacey, and as it turns out, I think hopefully we'll end up with a better product, because as we were talking about some things afterwards, we got very general and broad in what we were talking about, and we want to try and keep these focused because I want to have better things for you guys to actually be able to use, I suppose, and also to distill our thoughts down, because I use a lot of this to improve my own games that I run and stuff that I do as well. So hopefully we try not to get too broad, because then it's not really useful to anyone, I think. So I think we will just start off by listing a couple of our favorite monsters from any kind of media. So maybe one will do, so I guess to set this up, when we're talking about monsters, we're talking about not necessarily a villain necessarily. If you look on a scale of 1 to 10, right? 1 being like completely monstrous, like the xenomorphs from Alien, or something that doesn't have any kind of personality, right? And that would be 100% monster. And then on the other end of it, where it's 100% villain, it's more of a human personified kind of a thing. We're looking more at the other side of the spectrum, where they are definitely more monstrous. And we're going to talk about our two favorites, I guess. One being that is more monstrous, and then one that is a little more personified, I guess.
Sounds fair.
Right on. So you want to go ahead and start it off?
Okay. My pick for just the plain monstrous creature is the scarab beetles from The Mummy. So they're really just bugs, but they're hyped up for the movie to be like this terrible thing that like climbs onto you, burrows into your skin, and climbs into your brain.
Right.
And there's something uniquely terrifying about parasitic infection in general.
That's fair. Yeah.
It's sort of like the fear that you get with cannibalism, but added into something that's beyond your control, because now it's inside of you and you can no longer fight it because it's a part of you.
Well, then there's no reasoning with it either, because they're just bugs.
Right.
There's no please no, you can't plead for mercy from things that are just, they just want to be fed, essentially, And there's a couple cool scenes I always think of from that movie when
you can see the giant lumps
crawling
that look
under,
like boo-boos from the plague,
right?
Just like all over this guy,
yep.
Like moving and
yeah, no, terrible, awful. Right on, that's a good one. So would you just want me to do my more monstrous one first off, I guess, and then we'll go back and forth. My favorite is from Pan's Labyrinth. And if you haven't seen Pan's Labyrinth, you need to stop what you're doing and go watch that movie, because it is amazing. Guillermo del Toro does an amazing job in that movie. Just everything about it is awesome. But in it, there is this scene where it's kind of like a fairy tale story, and the main character, she's a young girl, and she goes into this kind of fairy tale world, and there is a monster sitting at the end of a table, and the table is full of all kinds of food. It's like a giant feast with all kinds of amazing food, and giant feast and meal prepared. And the girl, the main character in the movie, is in the Spanish Civil War. Is there a Civil War? Yes, the Spanish Civil War in like the 1930s, 1940s, somewhere in there. And at the end of the table is extremely pale creature with a lot of extra skin hanging off of him. And he has no eyes. He just has a mouth. He doesn't even really have a nose either. And he has hands on his eye, or I said that backwards, eyes on his hands. And she's warned to not touch anything on the table and everything will be fine. But the minute she takes anything from the feast, then something bad will happen. So, of course, as is all with all fairy tales, she takes something off the table.
She does the one thing that you're not supposed to do, whatever the thing is.
Exactly. And he wakes up and he can't see her, but he like can kind of smell. He has like these two nostrils, and he's kind of sniffing at the air.
Like snake-like or reptilian sort of slits.
Yeah, he does. I didn't ever thought of it in those kind of terms. But then he you don't realize he has the eyes in his hands at first, and then he holds his hands up to his eyes, and then you see the eyes in the palms of his hands, and it is just terribly creepy. And like I said, he has all this extra skin hanging off of him, so it looks like at some point he was satiated and was way heavy, way big guy, but has since then
use the word
sat
corpulent.
there. Yeah, right on, corpulent. And has since then lost a bunch of weight, and now he's, I wouldn't say emaciated, but he's very, very thin.
He's pretty emaciated.
You think so? I'm trying to vision him in my mind, and he may have been.
I just keep seeing the long, spindly, bone-like fingers.
And
There's
hands.
Nothing there to it. And,
Right.
The skin pulled taut over the head. Almost, if you haven't seen the movie, everybody pretty much seen Harry Potter. His face is very much like Lord Voldemort,
Yeah,
with the
very
sort of
similar to the
serpent-like nose, very pale, the very taut skin.
Mm-hmm. But no eyes.
Yeah, but no eyes.
But then he holds his hands up to his eyes with palms out, and then you see the eyes in the palms of his hands, and he's kind of moving around trying to find her, and just the way he moves is so kind of unnatural, and it's almost like when you watch those old-timey movies and they're filmed at the wrong speed from what you're watching, and they're kind of like herky-jerky and not moving at the right speed, and it's just so unnatural.
He's just dubstepping.
It could be. Takes a lot of the awesome out of his monsterness if he is dubstepping. But anyway.
Oh, does it? Or does it make him more of a villain? Just a little less monstrous.
No. So that's my more monstrous choice. So what would be your choice for a monster that is more human or personified, but not quite on a full-on human?
I am a big fan of Anne Rice. That's kind of where I entered into the vampire world, is through her books at a pretty young age. And there is a book that she writes in her Vampire Chronicles called The Queen of the Damned. And the Queen of the Damned is Akasha, and she is an Egyptian queen, basically, who's lived for millennia. She'd be like a Methuselah, basically. And she gets my nod for more human-esque monster, but I still would not call her by any means human, obviously.
Right.
She's a vampire, but she's she almost incorporates what you see in the World of Darkness system as you get to a loss of humanity, to where you just don't even make sense on the same level of good and evil judgments anymore. There is no more humanity there. So it actually starts off with her and her husband in a what would be a torpor state. So they are basically living statues. They don't move for anything, and even there's a couple of the older vampires that have fed on them before and still just don't move, just sit there like stone. But at some point she wakes up and now she gets woken up because of Lestat, but she doesn't exactly fit with him. It's not like a friendly relationship. It's like, oh, you are a creature that I find interesting and now you belong to me. Right. It's not so much love as it is just pure possession of this thing. And then the story goes on and it kind of evolves from there. But I like the idea of a monster that is so far out of your realm.
You mean power-wise?
Power-wise, yeah. It's completely on a different scale. So now this is something you're either going to have to find a very unique way to combat, something that you're going to have to hide from, reason with, or in some way pool resources in order to fight it. This is not a solo mission.
Right on. I haven't read that one. I've seen the movie, but I know the movie was not at all close. But
There's a lot of actually very interesting nods correlating with World of Darkness in the book, like how she's overcome in the end. I feel like I can talk about it. I mean, the book's been around forever. You've read it by now. It's not going to decrease the enjoyment you're going to have.
Right.
But they take in that whole kind of passing down sort of diablerie thing. But in this, it's actually an eating of the brain and the heart.
Brain and the heart.
Yeah. So they have to consume those two pieces of her in order to kind of like disperse that power.
Right on. So mine is my personal favorite horror movie and all around bad guy, I guess, is from Hellraiser, which would be Pinhead. And I like Pinhead on basically nearly every level that the character exists. And if you've read the not Telltale Heart, what's the story that he's from Clive Barker?
It's definitely not Telltale Heart.
No, that's
written
Edgar
by
Allan
Edgar Allan Poe.
Give me 1 second.
Isn't it just called Hellraiser?
No, it's not.
Hellbound, Hell something. I feel like it has hell in the title.
So after we Google it, is Hellbound Heart. I knew it was something close to the Telltale Heart, but it's the Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker, which eventually gets adapted into several movies, some that are better than others. But the idea behind...
Most are excellent.
Yes.
There's that one. It's kind of like the Halloween franchise, right? You're like,
Right.
I don't know what they were thinking on number 3. But
I am proud to say there are no laser buttons in the Hellraiser movies. I'm just saying.
I don't know. There's that whole Toy Man Hellraiser in space thing. There may be laser buttons in that one. I
That
don't know.
one
I have to
wasn't
go
the
back and watch
best,
it
but it
again.
was more like looking back at things. I'll let it go. But one of the things that I like about Pinhead specifically is that one, just looking at him is very like, he has a very definite look to him, right? You know, like all these pins in his head and everything.
He's a man who's fallen on hard times.
But he's got the kind of, I don't know, the fetish get up almost in a way, you know, like with
Not kind of.
Well, I guess, yeah, you're right. It
The
is.
man is wearing black leather strappy suit that is skin tight.
Right. So
There's a lot of S&M feel to
Yeah,
that entire
yeah.
series.
Well, there's this cool thing with him, this borderline between two polar opposite things, like the border between where does pleasure and pain meet together, you know, and that idea of kind of two polar opposite feelings or emotions or concepts kind of crashing together. And I find that to be kind of in as a concept in horror, I find it to be kind of interesting, you know, and the idea that Pinhead doesn't show up to just get random people. He only shows up when he's summoned, and he only takes bad people, generally speaking.
But I feel like it's more than that, though. Like, it's not like he only takes bad people. Like anybody, there's a certain kind of almost that fairy tale feel again, where it's like, you know, oh, curiosity. This is the thing I should not be messing with.
Yeah.
And you're not like evil necessarily, but like he's almost like the bouncer, you know, of the terrible S&M hell world that you
Right.
end up in. You know, like is he really evil? Like he's just a guy doing a
I
job.
think that kind of comes back to exactly what you were talking about with the lady from the Queen of the Damned, is that he doesn't exist on a human morality at all.
Yeah, he has a different morality scale.
Mhm, exactly. So he kind of operates at a different level than what people do, and I think that's one of the features of that kind of bad guy that make them compelling in a way, is that they used to be people. You know, Pinhead used to be a person just like, you know, this vampire lady did, but as time goes by and they develop into something else, they become more of this monster kind of character.
I find him particularly interesting, though, because in his set of stories, his appearance and his bad guy-esqueness, I guess, kind of sets the tone in order to give you that reflection of, okay, well, he's not really evil. It's these characters that are pursuing this thing that are
Right.
actually evil. You know, he serves very well as a kind of, I don't know how you want to say that, but, you know, he kind of sets up the expectation for this is where the bad is going to be.
Yeah.
In order to highlight that the bad is actually human and not outside of the self. So to
Well,
speak.
and then it's just I find it interesting that he's the bad guy that really doesn't, like, in a lot of the monsters and villains in general, or not so much villains, definitely monsters, they generally in terms of like fairy tales, if we're looking at that kind of a trope or whatever, they punish innocence and they punish curiosity. But in the case of Hellraiser and Pinhead, he doesn't punish innocence necessarily. He leaves the innocence alone, and he's punishing the people that are summoning him and the people that are bad and do evil things, which I think is kind of a, what do you call that? It's like this idea from the Requiem with Lancia Sanctum. They're God's avenging angels, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. And he's there to punish the wickedness, even though he's a bad guy.
And I think what makes him still fall in the monster category is, as opposed to being just a villain in general, is that he has no choice in the matter.
No.
There's no, oh, well, you talked me out of it, I can't take you. There is just, you opened the box,
right,
and now I am here, and this is what is going to happen. And there is no choice for him or for the other person. It is just
it's a foregone conclusion.
A foregone conclusion.
He's almost like a force of nature in some ways. So.
Yeah, exactly.
All right on. Well, with these 4, I guess we're just going to kind of box them in, and we're going to focus on them and what makes them good monsters, what makes them add to the plot, what makes them, I don't know, just make things more interesting as opposed to it just being another slasher flick or whatever, Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So let's start with the monster. We kind of talked with them at the beginning of this. On the more monstrous side of things with the scarabs, right? And I think it ties into anything that is viewed as like a horde, right? So that you could include this with the aliens, the xenomorphs from Alien, because they're this mass evil that can't be
zombies.
Yeah,
is a good one. Yep. I mean, there you're incorporating the horde and a certain amount of cannibalism as well.
Right.
Mindlessness, all of that is there.
So the one thing you mentioned, the scarabs, that's incredibly relevant is that they are very thematically appropriate to the Mummy.
Yes.
So whatever, if you want to have some kind of a horde monster, you need to make sure that it is relevant to whatever genre or plot that you're running. I guess that would be the first take-home point
and there
for this.
Are dozens of examples. So let's say you're running like an adventure game. I distinctly remember before the scarabs, something that scared the crap out of me was an episode of MacGyver, where a guy, there's like this swarming river of fire ants, and this guy falls into it. Oh, God, I'm probably like 7 years old watching this. So he falls into this swarming pit of fire ants and just disappears, and you see like his glasses floating on top of the swarm of fire ants. Like the same principle, but more of an adventure setting.
Right.
In Jurassic Park, I know a lot of people didn't like the Lost World movie, but the tiny little velociraptors, same thing, a pack of tiny animals that are going to cause a huge problem for you.
Right. In that by themselves, they are no problem to deal with, but this overwhelming force of them and what it is. And if you watch in those movies, there is always a series of red shirts, essentially, that get devoured first before they present a real danger to the heroes, or in this case, characters, right? So you need to make sure that they... Maybe some foreshadowing with them where, like, if you're going to use the vermin, the bug style thing, that you hear this chittering, that what is the wing on wing noise kind of thing. Everybody knows that. It's just, I don't know.
Flying ones are good too.
Yeah.
Like the Chronicles of Riddick. What's the first movie?
Oh,
the
Pitch
bird,
Black. Yeah.
Pitch Black, the little pterodactyl birds.
They reminded me of Sturges a lot from Dungeons and Dragons, the giant creepy mosquito things,
You could do the same thing in water with like a piranha type creature.
But all of these are setting appropriate. They make sense within the context of the story, which is the biggest thing, I think the most important piece for this kind of horde.
I like that they add an extra level of danger too, because it's one thing to say that you're going to die. It's another thing to say that you're going to be eaten to death.
Yeah, devoured.
A term that I coined in our previous.
Completely.
Eaten to death. And then it's an entire other thing when you add in the parasitic thing that says you're going to be eaten to death from the inside out.
Right. Well, the other thing is they're not the real bad guy either. They are almost like background and setting in a lot of ways, and the same is true of a lot of the zombie kind of movies, is that this horde, this giant mass of vermin or whatever that are coming to eat you, they're not the real bad guy. They're just this constant pressure, this constant external pressure to drive you either towards or away from the villain when the chips are down and as the plot moves along. And I guess it's just a way to continuously raise the stakes and increase the tension, and which is something that I feel like kind of gets lost in some ways, and it can be overdone because you can only be run from the horde of monsters, I guess the horde of nameless monsters, so for so long before it becomes kind of cliche. Well, yeah, but like if you're
you have to follow through.
if you're 4 adventures deep though, and this has been the catalyst to sort of increase the danger and increase the tension, perhaps it's time to move on to another trope, right?
Right.
But in the sense that it's a very useful tool when done right. It adds a lot of tension, especially if you've got out the if you're in a gaming group that is really big into using the grid and the minis to move around and stuff, and you have we have several minis that represent like bug hordes or whatever. It's like a pile of beetles or whatever. And seeing those move towards you, you know, when you're coming into a bottleneck or tactically on the battle map, it's not ideal for you. That can have a really big impact. And at the same time, in a narrative sense, it can have a really big impact as well when we just described the setting as you're running down this narrow hallway through a pyramid in the case of the Mummy, and the lights are going down and you can't find a way out. Like that's a huge way to raise the stakes and press the action and the sense of danger and urgency, right? But you can't go to that well too much.
Yeah. I like it too, though, because it's forcing your physical characters to do something else. Because now you're not just talking about this monster we can band together to fight. There's a certain amount of hopelessness that's inherent in this. Like you're going to have to think of either a way to kill these things faster or be overwhelmed, or you're going to have to figure out a way to get away. So now you're taking that physical challenge and you're shifting it a little bit.
And just a word to the wise, either solve the problem with fire, which is generally the way those things are dealt with.
Fire is always helpful.
Or run away. And I would lean towards run away because fire is she's a fickle mistress. So, but do you think there's any other common threads to draw on besides that sort of hopelessness? You can't reason with it. It's going to devour you entirely, and killing one won't make a difference. Killing 2 won't make a difference. There's just too many. Is there anything else in that kind of...
I think we talked about the mindlessness a little bit, but I think that's another important thing, because even when you're talking about goblins, at a certain point, you're going to get that, okay, well, maybe there's only 1 or 2 of us left, guys. We're going to run away. We're going to retreat. Or you have some kind of thought, you know, maybe the odds of reasoning with them are small, but it may still be able to be done.
Right.
There is no reasoning with this. There is no mind to it. It is never going to retreat, no matter how many of them you squash, kill, whatever.
Yeah, they're just coming to...
mindless and relentless.
Hungry.
Yeah.
Hungry hippos. Those are the big pieces for that kind of horde, I guess, my idea. Now, the character from the monster from Pan's Labyrinth is an entirely different thing. He's he plays on a lot of the more classic monster tropes, I think, that would be there, in that he's very alien. The way he moves, his physicality, while it resembles a person, he's humanoid, right? But he's very definitely, if he was a human or a person at some point, he definitely is not now. And
I think that almost makes him better than some of your other kind of strictly big bad monsters, in a sense, in that the ways that he is human really makes you appreciate all the ways that he's really not.
Yeah, well, it's very
like,
subtle in a way.
How human can I make him look while still hitting all of your buttons of wrongness?
Yeah. I think it actually hits the buttons of wrongness even more because it's close enough to resemble a person, but far enough away to where like that is not how a person moves or behaves.
It's like that point in the horror movie where you see like the sick, hunched over person. You're like, oh, can I help you? And then they turn around and you're like, oh God, I've made a fatal mistake.
Right. Well, I think that's a big piece of this. Is it's like perhaps that in being devoured or killed or taken captive by this creature, you might become that. And that's a big piece of this whole thing as well, is to draw on, is to know that maybe they didn't start that way, but they are that way now. And that also ties in with creatures like the Pinhead and what's your lady's name?
Akasha.
I
don't even know if I'm saying that right, but that's what I'm going with.
Close enough for us. So
that's how reading goes, especially with names. I don't know. This is how I say it.
Right. But I think then that sense of becoming that which you're becoming the monster in a way. And I think that's a big trope for that as well. And then
There's a threat of identity loss.
and then the idea of being eaten again is present with him. And this goes back to a lot of the fairy tales with trolls or giants, eating children or people that do the wrong thing, and never being able to be satiated, always still continuously being hungry and having to feed again and again and again, even though he has this entire huge thing of food in front of
It's
him.
just some of my favorite like Greek myths, right? Where like, the water that's there until you go to bend down to take a drink and then it slowly recedes away and dries up.
Right.
I forget which Greek mythology guy that is, but
I guess the idea of having, like, he's a pretty good monster, right? And I would say he's a pretty solid monster in any scene that he would have been put in, right? But in the context of him sitting at that table and having all that food laid out for him and not eating it, it's all there, it's untouched basically, right? There's carved meat and all kinds of stuff, and he's wasting away. Like we mentioned, he's pretty much emaciated, and he still doesn't eat any of it. And using the setting and the surroundings around the monsters to sort of reinforce what he is a great way to do that.
You didn't mention it, but just to kind of clarify for anybody that hasn't seen it, the monster is not something that communicates. He does not talk. So all of that extra information that you're pulling together about the way he looks and what is going on with his backstory is all because the setting informs his story.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it's a good point, because there's no exposition that happens to talk about why he's there or who he is. It's just all things that you are able to discern by looking at the things that are around him.
Right.
And this one really draws on, it never even occurred to me until we just started talking about this. It really does draw on a lot of those old fairy tales about, children being eaten by the witch or being eaten by the troll or the giant or whatever. And that's very, very much present in there. But I think it makes it even a little more alien, because in those settings, the witch talked. You could reason with her. The giants, the trolls, all of that, to a certain degree you could. But this, whatever it is, I guess, is completely alien, and it doesn't even like move or behave correctly,
Right.
And again, he is bound by some rules. And I guess that's one of the things that we keep coming back to. And I think we'll talk about with the more villainous monsters, is that they all have a set of rules that they are bound to adhere to in a way. And those can make things better as well, because the players can kind of foreshadow for themselves, if they know the rules that these monsters work by and live by, then when they get into those situations, they sort of have this expectation of doom coming, right? Because while you might be able to prepare for what's going to happen, there's still the risk that things might go wrong,
I think it's interesting that both of the characters that you pick operate in a separate plane of existence from your core characters. So he's like on what would be the other side of a hedge,
right?
So to speak.
In the
There's
fairy
some
world.
kind of portal to enter into his world,
Right.
and the same thing is true with Pinhead.
Oh, I didn't even think about that. That's very cool. Yeah. Interesting. I wonder what that means.
Let's psychoanalyze it. I didn't know if, I guess apparently that was not intentional.
No, it wasn't.
I didn't know if that was part of your monster tropes that you like, but
I guess that, I do like things that are otherworldly, not necessarily entirely alien. I like that, which we'll talk about with Pinhead in a minute here, but I like things that are relatable in a way, because I think one of the cool horror tropes that I enjoy to play on is that you see a little bit of yourself in the bad guy, in the monster, and in the villain a lot of times too. I think it's easier to see yourself in a villain than it is in the monster, and I think when you can relate to the monster on a personal level, man, that's really good. It's it really drives a point home, and it brings another level of horror to the movie or gaming experience.
Another point here too is that from like a storytelling perspective, you can decide how hard you want to make it for your PCs, and maybe you can dial that level of intensity up by taking them, whether they're on their playing field with the monster or they're in the monster's playing field with the monster.
Well, I think we could probably do an entire episode on monster layers, really, to be honest, because that sets up, it's such a huge trope, and there's so many things inside the layers that can inform what the monster is, their strengths, their weaknesses, all this kind of stuff.
And you see the same thing when people are a little more familiar with the Stranger Things now, because that's happening when you have the Demogorgon sort of monster, and he's almost something that you can reckon with when he's in the mortal world. But once you step into the Upside Down, he's no longer something that you're able to contend with. You see throughout that show, maybe we're going to ambush him or we're going to fight back against him. But once we're on the Upside Down, it is purely about hiding and escaping. There is nobody battling that monster in his realm of existence.
That goes back to the idea of monsters having, and this is almost all of them in from every creature flick to almost every piece of literature with monsters in it, is that there is some place where when you're in the monsters world, you are on his terms and he's unfathomably strong, and then there's some critical flaw or weakness in him that you have to draw him into some kind of a trap where you can set off whatever your plot is to use the kryptonite or whatever it is that you need to destroy it.
It's definitely the water. Use the water.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Swing away.
Yeah. So that was that was such terrible M. Night Shyamalan ding dong. God. Anyway, but I guess just to wrap up the Pan's Labyrinth, guys, that to use the setting around and really describe what is there to reinforce the ideas and the concepts of the monster. And you can even foreshadow that so that when they would enter the space where this creature would live, you can describe those things that's around him, and not just things that they would see, but the smells and the whether the air is moist and has that rotting meat scent to it, or just how everything feels. There's much more than just describing how things look. And that can really drive home that monster and make him much more impactful and relevant to your plot lines. And again, in this case, I didn't do it intentionally, but just like with your horde that you're running away from, a chase scene ensues as the little girl tries to get away from him. And it's granted, she's a young girl, so she's not really in a capacity to be able to attack and fight him. But I would, even if the main character was different and could fight, I don't think it would go that way with the story the way it's presented, and that they have to escape from this monster, and fighting it isn't really the best solution in this case. So right on. Well, do you have anything else to add about just more monstrous creatures and making them more interesting? I mean, we talked about using the setting around them to kind of set things up. We've talked about the inhumanity and the inability to reason with the more monstrous creatures, and that's true of everything from Godzilla all the way down to, teeny tiny beetles, right? That's just a big trope of what that is. Anything else?
Oh, I think that hits the highlights.
Hits the highlights. I'm sure. I mean, like we could probably sit here and talk about this for days and days and days, but just to hit some highlights to use, because I feel like when you have too many tools in your toolbox, that sometimes, or not necessarily tools in your toolbox, when there's too many things to keep track of in terms of what you're trying to do with your monsters and emphasize things, sometimes things can get muddied and lost. So pick a few important aspects and focus on those. Because like when you think of your favorite monsters, what is it about them that makes them interesting to you and makes them compelling, and focus on those things, because at a certain point it gets to be too much, and then you've lost your players and their interest and the impact of what you're trying to convey. So right on. Well, I guess we'll just move right into the more personified ones then. So do you want to start with
Akasha?
Yeah, I know the tropes were, but I haven't read that book, but I very much, very familiar with the Methuselah idea. It's one of the things that I like to draw on. So
basically a Methuselah
right.
is what you're getting into there. So I kind of already touched on it a little bit, but so some of the things that I like about her and other characters of her type is the strength that is there, and that is not able to be overcome, and most certainly not by an individual. And you see the same thing in your classic dragon of Dungeons and Dragons. Like, this is a creature. It has a higher level of thought, but it has its very own motives that you are not a part of, and a strength that you are not going to be able to combat, particularly as a low level character or what have you, on your own. And I also really like the idea of the power, because now we're talking about a creature that could easily kill you if it wanted to.
Right.
But maybe for whatever reason, you're interesting, or maybe it's bored. You're not really going to be completely aware of what its motives are, but it's just going to use its power to be in charge of you. It's basically like a big old giant bully, and you can't do anything about it.
One of the other things that is interesting about that type of character with this incredible power that could just squash you like a bug is one of the things that you can do with characters is that because they are so powerful that it makes a blind spot sometimes. And as long as the characters can operate inside that blind spot of, they don't even matter to me yet. That's a problem for my henchmen or whatever. And they can, as long as they can exist in that little sweet spot for as long as they can to prepare, they don't really pop up on the radar as a real threat for the monster yet. But once they do, then that has to be managed well. And I think that's one of the things that you can focus on is that emphasizing when they make choices, how overt are they being? How hard are they working to keep things hidden so that whatever it is that they're doing doesn't pop up on the radar? So in terms of if it's a dragon, in your example, like to compare her to a dragon, if you're trying to find all the anti-dragon weapons in the area and buy them up.
Now, there is some more risk in dealing with her than you get with a dragon, because in the classic vampire sense, she is attached to all of her bloodline. In the story, if you just kill her, you kill every vampire that comes from her line. It's sort of like Dracula, you know, you have to kill him in order to save the souls. There's a bigger impact. There is a greater risk involved in dealing with her.
Were any of the characters in the books that they
actually,
were tied to?
When she wakes up and starts moving around, she goes through, and it's almost like a Gehenna situation where I've decided I'm going to cleanse
her bloodline.
My bloodline.
Right.
So all of the younger vampires in the story basically spontaneously set on fire and start combusting.
Okay.
And the closer she gets and walking across the country or whatever, the closer she gets to them and the younger they are, they just burst apart,
evaporate.
Basically.
Right.
And so there's this fear of that too. Like, she can destroy me. You know, she doesn't even have to touch me. She can just choose to destroy me at any point. It's almost like
a force of nature
almost
or a god
anywhere in the
way.
world. Yeah.
Right.
But inherent in this particular type of monster is also a reward. So that's a big difference between when you're talking about the mindless horde, you're not really going to get anything from defeating them. If you happen to work out a way to overcome her, you get to have her power.
Right.
Which is a huge,
drastically different thing than the other side of the more monstrous.
And it's the same thing with the dragon, right? You overcome the dragon, you get the dragon's horde.
The horde, the renown, the experience points, all of that.
Right.
Let me ask you a question. When they talked about in that story where if you killed her, you killed all of her bloodline, were there any characters in the book that were important to the story or to the main characters that were part of her bloodline, that if they killed her, they would kill?
Was part of her bloodline.
Oh, really? Even Lestat and all them?
Yes. It's her and her husband. And when she wakes up, she devours her husband.
Oh, okay.
And it is her. She is Cain in this story.
Okay, right. Okay. I'm trying to put things in perspective. So like that's an even bigger thing to play on there too, is that killing her,
she is the Highlander.
Well, yeah, like it has a huge impact. It will break the world in a way, and not just the world in the sense that like the society or whatever, but it will break the characters' world because it will destroy them, right? And then you get to play on this idea that, well, death isn't the solution. The solution is not to kill her unless you just want to play a game of self-sacrifice where the characters play out a situation where they have to ride into the blaze of glory moment, which is cool. That's a perfectly valid thing to do, but you have to realize there's no game after that, right? You have to start a new game. So if that's what you want to play on, that's fine. But it is a cool thing to see. There can be some great role-playing moments when you have players that are looking at the situation and trying to find a way around it to where maybe we can torpor her or stake her and put her in a box and bury her in the Marianas Trench or something, right? To where no one can get to her except for James Cameron and his spooper awesome submarine, right? But like, that's a thing in and of itself to where we're not just fighting against the bad guy, we're fighting to also work against the bad guy, but not kill ourselves and our friends.
Yeah. And I would encourage you, if you want to incorporate that in your game, to force your PCs to make the decision to work with some NPCs that they would have previously put as off limits.
Oh, right. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right.
That's
precisely.
a big, absolutely. That's a really good one. Although that one is kind of specific because in terms of a curse or a bloodline that's passed down, that's very specific. Now, I'm not sure that it would directly incorporate into a fantasy thing unless you just took it from the curse perspective. That's really what vampirism is it's a curse. And maybe some of I don't think you should do all of the characters necessarily, but I think it's almost more interesting if half of the characters or two of the characters of the six or one of the four are affected by this curse, and killing this creature will, because of some bloodline thing that they don't know about in ancient ancestors or whatever, will impact them. And then how do we deal with that as a party? And there's a lot of inter-party conflict that can happen and cool role-playing moments that you can get out of that, because while defeating the enemy, the bad guy, right, the monster, is the most important thing to the mission, but how is it that we do that? And if you think of a lot of your classic vampire story, Dracula, right? Mm-hmm. There's this whole debate that happens with them of how to kill and fight Dracula. And that's a huge moment of the story, if I remember correctly, where they're debating how to do it and techniques and what weapons and garlic and all this kind of stuff.
There's a montage.
Yeah, and it's a big part of creature movies. In every creature movie.
Well, in that lane of a plan.
Yep.
In order to try and trap the creature, because again, you see that if I fight the creature on its terms, I'm going to be at a major disadvantage. Yeah. Whereas if I set it up in such a fashion that the environment is on my side, then that gives me an advantage that could be pivotal to success.
Right. Well, I really, really like the idea of, and this is something that I like to play on in vampire games, is that there are bigger consequences to winning sometimes than just winning. While that's the goal, but there's all that comes at a cost, essentially, right? Nothing is free.
Yeah. Well, and in classic vampire political
fashion,
fashion, you see the ultimate decision of, okay, well, if we kill her, we have to consume these pieces of her, and in order to take on her power so that everyone does not die with her.
Right.
So then there's the decision of, okay, well, who gets to have that power?
Right.
and the argument and discussion that stems
really
from
where
that.
The debate is, right? Yeah, exactly. All right. Is there anything else about the Methuselah thing? I guess we didn't really touch on how she is basically power that you can't fathom. I mean, we did touch on it a little bit, but that is for this style of monster or bad guy, that is a big thing to realize, is that a full-on, straightforward bull charge assault is 100% not an option, right? In that, where with the horde idea, it could be, if it's well planned, purify with fire, right? In the case of the beetles or whatever, that's totally an option and even likely to succeed. But in this case,
so I suppose I could elaborate on it. I talked about how they're kind of statuesque. They can't be damaged by any weapons, basically. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the feeding, it's just kind of an issue of whether or not they choose to let you feed on them.
Right.
Because otherwise their skin is like stone.
Right.
In this story, they can actually be laid out in the sun and they will basically just tan.
Oh, wow.
But some of the younger creatures that are of their bloodline will burst into flame because they are in the sun. But
right.
It does not impact them in the same way. Mm-hmm. They can choose to just annihilate someone by thinking about it. It's like sort of like that Simisi property of I can see everything that is connected to me all at once sort of thing.
Do they have any kind of mind control? Did she in that one or no?
Telepathy is there, and there is that kind of dominate aspect.
Right.
I'm calling you and you will come here. Mm-hmm. And now you have to, sort of the same way as Dracula. I am calling to you, you will come here.
Hypnotizing.
It is going to take you effort to resist that pull.
Well, that's one of the big things for these style of monsters as well, is that losing your free will is a big trope for monsters. And you can draw on that with things like mind flayers or beholders or any kind of mind control things. But the idea that I am no longer in control of myself and am making choices that are not only not good for me, but they're downright bad for me, right?
Right.
And that's a very cool trope to play on, but you have to be very careful with that, because a lot of players, depending on what style of games they like, don't like to have their own agency taken away from them, and they want to be able to make their own choices and some people draw this line at the free will of my character is mine, and then everything else in the world is yours. So just know where that line is with your players if you're going to play on that.
And if you want to just subtly cross it, then you can use that idea of just possession. So where the free will is yours, and you can choose to violate that, but the consequences will also be
be very dire. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's that hard choice, and that's really what a lot of these things are about. Is that you have to make a choice, both of which options are not good, right? They're both painful. You just have to choose which one that you choose for whatever reasons. Maybe you have a plan developed around it, or there are things that you can work with in the terms of options that are presented or whatever. Right on. Is there anything else about? We could do a whole thing on vampires as well and what they are. Well, I really want to do more World of Darkness stuff in the next year. It's not something we've mentioned, but we're big World of Darkness fans, and there's a lot there. And I think that World of Darkness is on a big rise and comeback, so there'll be more World of Darkness stuff to come from us because, well, we're big fans and we like it.
Yeah.
So,
and if that's something you're interested in, then I highly recommend reading the Queen of the Damned book, because it does a very good representation of the all powerful Methuselah.
Right on. All right, so I guess we'll move on to Pinhead now.
Yeah, let's do it.
Right on. So, if you can't tell by the tone of our voices, we are both very big fans of Hellraiser, Pinhead, and Clive Barker in general. Yeah, I guess where to start. So he used to be a person, and he's relatable in that way. In the case of the Methuselah, not so much. You can tell that she used to be a person at one point, but it was so far back that it's almost, she's not human anymore.
Well, I would argue that in the first movie, Pinhead is very much that same way. You don't get more of that backstory until later on in the sequence.
That's fair. So he develops more as a character, I suppose. But he
becomes more villainous.
He very definitely is a force of nature. There's nothing that is going to stop him. It's just a matter of whether you're in his path or out of his path. And in a way, I'm almost not sure that he makes a good adversary in an RPG where you have to directly oppose him because he wants to kill you. Does that, unless you're into a Lovecraftian kind of a sense of things of doom, and it's a foregone conclusion that everyone is either going to die, go crazy, or go missing, right? In that sense, it's okay. Yeah, exactly. But he is a force of nature, and there is almost no stopping him.
I could see him being a very good, like, just little plot extra in like a Lamentations game. You know what I mean? Like that sort of, there is basically the puzzle box sort of thing. Like, here we are, on our little adventure, but should you choose to pick this thing up and investigate it,
right?
This is what will happen.
Right. So one of the tropes that he plays on is that curiosity is what sets a lot of this off, right? Is that there's a puzzle that gets solved and it summons him essentially, and he's called into to cross realms, right, into our physical realm, and along with him comes other Cenobites, which is that's what he is. If you haven't seen any of the Hellraiser movies, there are other what used to be people that are now punishing,
making them almost to like a demon.
Yeah, very much so. They in the lore of it, if you really want to go deep there, he's a priest of this group of people or whatever,
They are his cultists.
Yeah. So.
And mindless in the same sort of way of plain cultists versus master cultists.
Yeah.
They are his henchmen.
Right. And they don't really, like you mentioned, they don't really talk. They're not personified in a human kind of a way. They're more these impersonal things that are just going to be monstrous and kill you and torture you and in some cases eat you. But in the case of Pinhead, well, he does a lot in terms of the movies and the books to pursue people and drive them towards their demise. And I don't know, like we mentioned before, he has this kind of duality of emotions, right? Pleasure and pain is the one that he focuses on. And I think there's a lot there where you can do that with any two emotions. And I think that are, drastically contrasting, right? So whether that's pleasure and pain, or whether that's, the classic one obviously is good and evil, but what would be another example?
Bacon and sandals.
Bacon and sandals. We should mention the bacon and sandals morality.
Everything operates on a spectrum of either love or fear. Anyway.
So the bacon and sandals thing is a great example. I don't remember what it came from. I believe it was a meme somewhere. Whereas people's morality is based on good and evil, right? And we mentioned this Methuselah and Pinhead and how they do not operate on the same morality as humans. In fact, it's so alien that it is bacon and sandals, which is the example that they use, I believe, in some meme we saw, and that there's just no way for you to fathom it. It's just not possible for your human intellect to understand why they do or think the way they do. That's just what they are, right? And it's relatable exactly to a lot of Lovecraftian stuff, whether that's Cthulhu or Hastur or any of the cultists, that why they have them do the things they do. Well, it's because that their morality is just not at all human in any way, shape, or form. They're so alien. And I guess it's one thing that we didn't even mention with him is he does have a lot of Lovecraftian aspects to him, in that he is otherworldly and he is so powerful as to, you can resist, but you're going to lose and be torn apart. Your sanity is going to be destroyed, and he's going to basically destroy every part of who you were, right?
And he has the two methods of entry that you see in a lot of the Lovecraftian stories too. There's sheer bad luck curiosity,
right?
And then there's the studious pursuit of something more
that leads to badness. Yeah. This forbidden knowledge kind of trope
right,
idea.
Exactly.
Is that, and also along with that is the idea that if I summon him, everyone else did it wrong, and I will be able to control him and harness his power, right? And maybe that's where this kind of a character is better used, in terms of it's going to be a demon where you're not directly fighting him necessarily, you're fighting the person that summoned him, and that's how he gets drawn into the story maybe, and that you have to coerce the demon into just devouring the focus of his anger, because he's the one that summoned you here from the seven hells or whatever, and focus your anger there instead of on him and everything else, right? Mm-hmm. So there, there's the devil's bargain, obviously, terrible pun there, but it's very definitely one of those big tropes, right?
The other thing that I like about Pinhead is that in his story, nowhere is safe, because anywhere can be a portal into his world. He can step out of your closet. He can step out of thin air. It does not matter. He can get to you anywhere, anytime, any place.
Right. There's no home base that you can retreat to kind of regroup. You're always on edge in a way. Right on. What else with him? There's a big aspect of him, of his look, I guess, which is an important thing if you're going to build I think this kind of goes back to the guy from Pan's Labyrinth, is that he has a very definite, look, and it implies certain things because he has these chains and hooks that are always around him.
The nails in his head.
Yeah. I mean, there's a certain amount of even some of his one-liners that he has, about you don't know pain, I am pain, is this one that he has. And there's so many things with him that go unsaid. And I guess it almost goes back to the idea of the setting kind of laying out who the villain is. So in this case, it's not necessarily the setting, it's his look, right? And to make sure that, you plan that out, and that you don't just describe your monsters as flat, and just saying that, yeah, he's a guy who stands there and has these pins in his head and is in this kind of fetish outfit. And what do you do? Right? That's not very inspiring. It's not very...
You have to describe how he squeaks when he walks due to the tightness of the lip.
Right. Well, but that's an important thing. As he moves, the creaking and groaning of the leather, the paleness of his face, that sort of flat affect that he has when he talks about terrible things and inflicting pain in a way that kind of implies a certain amount of knowledge and experience that is, terrifying, because...
There are a couple of other very key aspects that come along with him that you can kind of gauge based on just what he's telling you and how he looks too. The first one is obviously body mutilation. Mm-hmm. So you're not talking about he's going to kill you. You're talking about torture. And you're also talking about long-term suffering. You're talking about eternity. You're not talking about a single isolated moment. This is going to be bad. Mm-hmm. You're talking about an inescapable torture.
Right. Which is the idea again, very Lovecraftian thing, this beyond space and time idea. And in one of the movies where the main character, the female character, goes into their world for a time, in the second one, I believe, and all the sort of seeing how alien their world is. In some of these where we talked about, with being in the temple, right, with the horde and the scarabs, right, that's still largely a human world, right? And crossing over into the Pan's Labyrinth sense with that monster, while it's in the fairy world, it's still got a lot of things that are very similar to the real world. And in the case of the Methuselah, obviously that is the real world, right? But when you go into this demon's world, into his world, it's very different. And I would draw back to the analogy of the bacon and sandals thing again, in that.
And he doesn't have to be Cthulhu inspired or a demon. You could very easily make a few very small tweaks and have him be a true fae in your Changeling game.
Very much. I think really in a Changeling game, you could take any of these and make them into that, because he would be the exact, like they talk about the true fae being personifications of specific things, right? And he would be the personification of pleasure and pain together, and that sort of conflict, or conundrum, I don't know, whatever. But sometimes I think that he is such a visual character that unless you're Clive Barker, the way he writes him is amazing, but it's hard to convey really the impact of him. And I feel the same way about a lot of the more like larger otherworldly villains like Hastur or something like. They're so larger than life, it's kind of hard to convey that.
I think in a single encounter, in a one-time description of him, I think it's something you more get a better sense of it as the scene goes on,
right?
Or as you encounter him more than one time.
That is something with him that is interesting, is that it's not a one and done kind of an encounter. It's a thing that gradually builds, and he enjoys the pursuit of you, which is something that can be true of the Methuselah as well. These more personified monsters, they like the idea of the fear of them and the pursuit of you and making you
you get that sort
game out of it.
Yeah, exactly, like a game. Like it's calculated. It's not a random tear down pursuit. It is logical,
right?
And that in and of itself is terrifying, to be pursued by something that has a higher level of cognition, and to be able to make those logical decisions.
It's like playing a game of chess where you're playing against a chess master and you're moving one piece at a time. You're playing chess and I'm playing checkers kind of moment.
And I think we didn't get the recorded audio here, but Kurt talked about his favorite monster being Hal
from 2001
Space Odyssey. So you see the exact same thing there. Cold, unreasoning logic that is operating on an intelligence level that you are not at.
Right, yeah. Well, in ways, it contrasts Pinhead pretty nicely, because while Pinhead is cold, he's not necessarily, I wouldn't say he's emotionless or necessarily even logical. It's just that's what he does, right? Whereas with Hal in 2001, that's all he is. He is an algorithm. And, if this is what makes sense to do because of the consequences of the actions, then that's what he does, and that's a whole nother episode in and of itself. And I do think that
AI is the villain.
We will do AI as the villain, I'm sure, at some point, because in a movie it's very easy to do, but I think it's a different monster to tackle. That was terrible. Oh my goodness. Yeah. But it is a whole different thing to tackle in terms of an RPG, to keep it interesting and compelling and moving forward, where you're not just like, well, everything in the world is against us and we're going to lose. So I think we could probably ramble at it forever. This has gone a lot longer than I figured it would. I thought this would be a quick one, but we love bad guys and monsters and horror, so go figure. We talked a lot. Do you have anything else to wrap up about Pinhead? I don't know.
No, I don't think so.
Well, I guess to sum this up, one, make sure that you use your setting as another feature of your monster, and to use that to describe the things that the monster can't say necessarily, right? Is that a fair way to say that, you think?
Yeah. Raise the stakes. Don't make it just about physical damage. There should be another greater risk inherent with it.
Right. Sometimes it's hard to do in terms of a gaming experience, but if you can create some kind of emotional risk where the characters...
Being eaten to death is always a good one.
Well, yeah, but that's still a physical danger in a sense, right?
It is, but it's upping that danger.
Yeah, it is. It definitely is. But if you can find some way to threaten the characters existentially, maybe if you have, in terms of a D&D game, if you have clerics or paladins or those style of characters, you can threaten them with eternal damnation or whatever, of losing their soul and not being able to go on to whatever afterlife that their god prescribes or whatever, is a great way to do.
train crash debate is always a good thing to incorporate too.
Yes.
Do I kill these 5 people or do I pull the lever and kill these 2 people?
Right. Exactly. The lesser of two evils thing. So right on. Well, I think that's going to do it for us today. And sorry about getting this one out to you guys a day late. But as I said, I kind of made a giant mistake and we recorded an entire episode that was entirely unusable. So hopefully that doesn't happen again. But as always, glad to get something out to you guys. And as you know, we are part of the Gonna Geek Network, and I'm super excited because, well, we're big Game of Thrones fans here. And I don't think that's any surprise. If you're listening to this and you're not a Game of Thrones fan, shame on you. but I guess it can be forgiven. Tyrion's Landing, another podcast on the Gonna Geek Network. It's about, well, Game of Thrones and how it's awesome. Jeannie, Nikki, and Rachel are going to be talking about season 7. The whole season in its entirety and who's going to live, who dies in the season. Check them out.
Because you all know you're just on the edge of your seat waiting for the next season.
Yeah.
So you might as well satiate that Game of Thrones hunger.
I know, it is kind of sucks because there's only 6 episodes in the next season and I'm stoked to see it. It's going to go by so fast. I don't know. Kind of bummed. But do you think he's going to write the books? Finish them all the way out or no?
No.
I don't think so either, because I saw a thing where they talked to him about and said that he fixed some of the problems in the book in the show that let me say this the right way. He had problems looking back with some of the books that he fixed in the show, and he was able to through editing and changing things.
I know he fixed my biggest problem with the books.
What's that?
The complete lack of full frontal nudity.
Oh, that is true. That is in the books too, quite a bit. I mean, but
so much more graphic on the screen.
I'm not sure that he's going to write the other books because it would have to be going back to write a story where he thought things weren't the way he wanted them to end up. You know what I mean? And I think that would be hard to go back and do. I hope he does. I mean, I will read them regardless if he does, but I don't know. We'll see. So anyway, check out Tyrion's Landing. It should be a good episode of them recapping the season, it sounds like. So check them out. And as always, you can support us by following us online at Twitter at JustOneMoreFix or online at JustOneMoreFix.com. If you like us, head over to iTunes or Google Play and give us a rating and comment. That would help us out a lot. Or the best way to support us is by letting people that you know that would be interested in gaming and letting them know about our podcast and sharing us with them because we have the best thoughts on gaming there is, right?
Absolutely.
Sounds good to me. All right. Well, I guess that'll do it for us, and we will see you guys next week. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetech.com. You can find us at justonemorefix.com and follow us on Twitter at JustOneMoreFix.